Thank you for coming. My name is Gina Apostol. I'm a novelist. I write about women in history, and in actually revolutionary history. I'm Filipino, and so I write about women in Philippine revolutionary times. And I'm very happy to be here to speak to Vimala. I haven't watched the play. I've only read the plays, so I'll be asking Vimala about her thoughts on this. Vimala Pasupathi is a professor of English at Hofstra, where she teaches Shakespeare and many other courses in English literature. Her research interests in early modern history include the status of women, the relationship between England, Scotland, and Ireland, which does occur in this play, and the legal institutions that structured communities and shaped people's lives. Her work on these topics has appeared in a variety of scholarly journals, including Early Theatre and Shakespeare, as well as several edited collections, most recently Histories of the Future, On Shakespeare and Thinking Ahead, and None a Stranger There, England and in Europe on the early modern stage. She is currently completing a book on military obligation in English drama, The Militia Theatre, 1558 to 1662, Stages of Obligation in English Drama and British History, and editing a 17th century play about the English Civil War, Bell in Campo, for Punctum Books. She is currently serving as Associate Chair of English at Hofstra and serves on the Board of Trustees of the Shakespeare Association of America. So thank you, Vamela, for being here with us.
I was so long. Apologies.
So this particular play, Henry VI, given your interest in Shakespeare, why, in terms of women in Shakespeare, this play? What is it about the women here?
Well, I think so. How many of you know the play at all? Okay. Oh, that's good. For those of you who don't, it's fine too. There are, in the part you'll see tonight, there are three really interesting female roles, and they are Joan of Arc, or Joan La Pucelle, Margaret of Anjou, and Eleanor, who is the Duchess who's married to the current protector of the kingdom. So the play's three women are interesting in part because of what they do and their role in the conflicts of the play. But they're also interesting because they're sort of set up in opposition and in parallel with the men that are so important to driving the plot. And so the play starts with the death of Henry V, and he's an important sort of specter over the play because he's a warrior who won territories in France at Harfleur and Agincourt, famously in Shakespeare's Henry V. And his son, Henry VI, who is now ruling, is a child. So already you have two sort of poles of masculine authority. You have a warrior king and a young boy who can't rule on his own and is represented by the protector. And then almost immediately after Henry V's death is mourned, all the territories he lost in France, or he won in France, are suddenly now lost. And so Henry VI is in this position of having to reclaim those territories while being a child, not fully being in charge of his own kingdom. So you have that war with France suddenly happening, and then on top of that, his nobles, basically because of the void of the strong leader king, have started to escalate their inner squabbles. And so he's got noblemen that aren't getting along, coupled with the Lord Protector, who is ruling as a regent, who is not getting along with his bishop, so his church official, and his government official not getting along, and then his nobles are starting to fight across family and dynastic lines. So this is a lot for a weak king, a young king to have to deal with. He's a devout and religious man, so there's another element of masculinity. And up against all these fighting men, you have these three women. And the traditional role for women in war is usually to help broker peace through marriage. And one of the women in the play will be sort of brought in for that, Margaret of Anjou. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have Joan of Arc, who is actually fighting for the French in the battles. And she is then a contrast to the weak Henry VI. She's also a contrast to the big warrior for England, Talbot. He and his son represent a sort of masculine warrior, aristocratic class. And then Joan comes in, and Joan is female. She's also young, a maid. She's French. She's Catholic. There are all kinds of things.
And she's a shepherd's daughter.
A shepherd's daughter.
So she's of that class.
And she's representing all these things that Talbot is not. And there are ways in which Shakespeare is elevating her really early on in the play, only to make sure that she is defeated eventually. But she's held up as this sort of warrior figure against all these warring men. And she, again, is both a parallel and a contrast to them.
I just wondered if Shakespeare had, because this is so early in Shakespeare's work, and it's almost like it's just, I thought, finger exercises for what became Richard III. It's like the backdrop for Richard III. And if he had had Joan of Arc later, she would have been so amazing, but he has Joan of Arc very early in his career, when he's still really stuck, I thought, in trying to figure out how to write a story, create a character. He's still, I thought, almost like trying to figure out who's the character, who's the main character. And Joan of Arc kind of moves into main character. She's basically main character. She has main character energy from the start. But she is, I'm Filipino, I grew up Catholic. She's a saint in the Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. And I always saw her as this person who is burned at the stake for her belief in Mary, for her belief in God, and against the evil Protestant Saxons, because of course in the Philippines, the Protestants are just evil. Talk about that, the way in which Shakespeare consumed Joan of Arc's story, how the English told the story. It's, to me, a story very much about how a nation produces the narrative, depending on where you are. Joan of Arc is this or that, versus French versus English Joan of Arc.
Yeah, so Shakespeare would have had access to a lot of different anecdotes about Joan in various printed texts, and most of them are obviously written from an English perspective, and so they're very keen on denigrating her. And characters in the play, you'll see, they use this sort of language of witchcraft. They talk about her in sort of sexualized terms.
Yeah, the language of witchcraft is really the language of misogyny.
Yes,
yeah.
and so trolls, whores, animals, these kinds of words come up in addition to the witchcraft. That it's all sort of under a larger rubric of misogynist discourse and language. And so Shakespeare uses that, exploits it, doesn't challenge it in fully, though you could say he puts those words in the mouths of characters that we probably don't think well of to begin with.
Yeah, right.
But there's, in addition to the things that Shakespeare would have known about, I think now in the 2026, we actually have access to really nice editions of Joan of Arc's trial and deposition. Mm-hmm. And those documents are really fascinating and paint a much fuller picture of Joan, the actual Joan Apostol, and her primary, like one of the things she's burned at the stake for is not witchcraft, it's for wearing men's clothes. And repeatedly across these testimonies, she is sexualized. We hear her accounts of every attempt at sexual assault. There are all kinds of accusations she makes against the male soldiers that she fought with, and they admit as much. You can see throughout the testimony, they are constantly in their depositions saying that they tried to touch her breasts or they, chased her or whatever. So they validate every accusation she makes, and the fact that she will refuse to put women's clothing on is really the issue that keeps coming back up in the trial and part of her execution. Shakespeare doesn't deal with that at all. and so he doesn't have a lot of sympathy for her, but he does allow her in a brief period of time to outsmart, outfight,
Yes.
there are these moments, and she really is the life of the beginning of the play. It's like, compared to Henry VI, the devout, contemplative young king, and compared to Talbot, who's super annoying. I think you'll hear a lot of speeches from the male characters that you're just like, ugh.
Yeah, they die soon, though.
Yeah, eventually. Not soon enough. But Joan is given a moment that highlights some of the exciting things about her.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I was so interested in that. So that does go to that other question I have about how close the women are historically in the play to actual events. I find it funny to check Wikipedia for any number of the characters, like the Duke of Gloucester, Jack Cade, etc., and consider that Wikipedia's summary of so-called history might be only a summary of what actually occurred in Shakespeare's play, because they're so I'm wondering about that. In what way does Shakespeare's history plays in turn shape our knowledge of this history?
Yeah, I think so. The women don't come up at length always in the histories, but the chronicles are weird in that there is a lot of
there's a lot on Margaret.
There's a lot of bottom-up history, so things you wouldn't expect. I think the thing that Shakespeare does with them is not necessarily change major details, but he sets things up in a structure so that we might read the chronicle and not see Joan, Margaret, and Eleanor as sort of three different kinds of feminine agency or lack of agency. So he allows us to see the characters together in a structure that allows us to compare them and think about them as a class in a way, even though these women are very different and come from different backgrounds, obviously.
Because it is interesting to see how you're not seeing part two, but in part two, how Margaret becomes the woman warrior in a weird way. Yeah.
Look forward to that. Margaret here is sort of the concubine or object of conquest that becomes the potential peace treaty between Henry and the French. But Margaret does take on more of a militant role in the second half, sort of being set up like Joan in a way. Yeah. And Eleanor is a different kind of figure from the other two, because rather than marriage or war, she sort of stirs up the members of the nobility to try to rally behind her husband.
She's a combo of the witch and the noblewoman. That's what Eleanor seemed to be.
All three women, though they're very different in how they are manipulated by political circumstances and how they attempt to sort of negotiate their own way through those circumstances, they all are called witches in some moment. They're all compared to animals. And they all have a sort of supernatural element to them.
And it is interesting for me to see the way the women are figured in the plays, and the truly evil, malevolent, the people that you really want to shaft are those men. I call it the bitch oligarchy. Like this oligarchy of men that are really the driving force of the play, but meant to be kind of elevated in this. I mean, it's a hegemonic. Shakespeare being definitely within that hegemonic space of England, writing his plays for the monarchy. At the same time, that there's an interesting. They're irredeemably just vile. And I'm wondering why the NatCo is producing a play about irredeemably vile oligarchy in our times. But anyway, so my last question is about, for me as a novelist, about decolonizing history. That's what I do as a Filipino, decolonizing American history from the point of view of those who were occupied by America. It's hard for me not to also read these plays with a decolonizing eye, ways in which you critique power through, in this case, in what ways does the plays critique power through issues of gender? Yeah.
So, I mean, just in general, I think the aristocracy doesn't come off so well.
Yeah. He's very aware of that, Shakespeare.
As you say, the bitch oligarchy, they're all so obsessed with one-upping each other. They're also all constantly reciting, and you'll notice, they're constantly reciting genealogies about why they should get more than what they're getting, or why they're in line for the throne, or this or that. And so the sense of entitlement that gets in the way of basic governance, like things that could help people, actual policies that Shakespeare and his characters are not interested in really digging into those, because so much oxygen is taken up by infighting between rich people. Right? And there's no clear sense that them getting something they want does anything other than they get what they want. And so I think there's a real indictment of that. And Henry VI is, there's clearly a critique of his inability to do anything about this. And there's a bit of irony in that Henry V, who we're supposed to think is a great king, when he also goes to war with France and brokers peace through marriage. When he gets married to Catherine, he says to her, "I hope you'll prove a good soldier breeder." And his son is basically ineffectual, but also, again, devout, contemplative, and maybe qualities we'd value in a leader if he were allowed to get older.
Yeah, there is an ambiguity in the way Henry VI is portrayed, I thought, because he is definitely, if you're going to see it only from that martial sense, but he's a guy who just finally says, okay, I'm going to compromise, towards the end of the play, and not kill people, not have people go to war. But are there questions from the audience about the play or anything that we talked about?
Yeah, I guess
Yes, yeah.
I first came to know Joan, of course, through Shaw, right? And when you read St. Joan, and then I remember being surprised as a young person to happen on to Joan in the Henry plays, and like, wow, this is really different. And I always think, Shaw always considered Shakespeare to be overrated, thought he was the better playwright, all those sorts of things. But the character is also really, and they were both writing for English audiences, but it really seems like, Shaw's doing something completely different. Seems to be exonerating Joan, and says a lot of positive things about her. So I just wonder how that worked, or what the...
Yeah, well, I don't know that I can't speak to the moment where what Shaw is doing in his moment. Yeah. But in Shakespeare's, there's clearly an association with Joan with Catholicism. She talks about how Mary came to her in a vision before she was black and swart, and now she's, glorious and ready to fight on behalf of God and Mary. And I think that sense of her as Catholic is already damning, but Shakespeare associates that very strongly with witchcraft, and the way that Joan meets her end in the play, which I don't want to ruin it for anyone who doesn't know. Everybody knows that she's martyred, but there's the way that Shakespeare depicts her in the text, and then there's the way that this company depicts it. And this company does some slightly different things that I think don't denigrate Joan as much as Shakespeare did in the play. And
that's why I'm interested in watching it, because how are they going to do it?
I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to oversell it, but in the stage directions, Joan calls her familiars, her minions, to help her at one point, and in the stage directions, the minions appear. So it's not just that she's a little bit witchy. She is witchy.
Yes, definitely.
Validates that.
In the Shakespeare play.
And I think it's not quite so explicit, or it's much more ambiguous in the way that the company does it. And though the men do imply sort of things that are denigrating or not positive about Joan, I think the company has cut a lot of it, because there's much more of it. And there's a suggestion she's sleeping with the prince or the dauphin. everybody.
She actually says it in
Yeah.
the actual play.
Right.
Yeah.
In the text of the play, there's so many accusations of her sleeping with people and being a whore or a troll. And in the depositions, it's the opposite, right? Every time she's saying, I refused. They were all trying, but I refused, and I managed to retain my virginity. Shakespeare undoes that. This company doesn't, I think.
Could I say another thing about Joan that I saw in Shakespeare that is really, and it may be because we're watching the World Cup these days, it's England versus France, so it's really, her Frenchness makes her evil.
Oh, yes.
So there's a whole, and you see it in the World Cup. You see it, the whole nation, the attachments to nation that occur, and they're good attachments in the World Cup, but I think there's an interesting aspect there of her Frenchness, nation, that Shakespeare's producing nation in the plays, and so he's going to take on the voice of nation in the depiction of Joan. And I think there was a struggle for him as a writer, as an artist, to figure out, she's a very interesting character, but nation trumps a lot of the decisions, I think, that are made in the early plays, especially the early plays.
And it has a lot to do with the genre too, right? Because he's really trying to establish English history as
because that meditative prince, anti-war, non-combative person is Hamlet, which is his great play, but Henry VI, he can't figure out how to deal with a person who's not a good soldier.
I have a question. So you guys were talking about critique of power and how the oligarchs don't come off very well, but my impression of Henry VI, part 2, is that the lower class also does not come off very well. So I'm just wondering how you square that, is as thinking of the play as a critique of power.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's this impulse in most of Shakespeare to sort of stir the pot and then let it settle a little bit. And I think, there's sort of the famous reading is it's subversion, but then containment. And I think there's some element of truth to that most subversive elements in Shakespeare do get contained.
I would say.
And I think to go back to sort of the earlier question about what Shakespeare's doing, Shakespeare applied to be a gentleman. His father had applied to be a gentleman to get a coat of arms and was denied, but then Shakespeare applied and got it. And so, there's a certain degree where Shakespeare's aspirations might also be at work. That for whatever sympathy he might have with an underclass or the lower class, that he also has aspirations. He's a shareholder in his theater. He's making money. He
was a shareholder
property.
for a slave company, the early Virginia Company. That's Shakespeare. Because this is that era, the era of slaveholding.
And the money comes from the people who pay for seats as opposed to the people who are closer to the
But I will say that the entrance of Jack Cade in part, I don't know if it's part 2 or part 3, the rebellion, the Jack Cade rebellion. Yeah. There's a lot there that I find really interesting that he just, because there's so little of it, but it's still interesting that he does that. He gives space for the rebel, and they're very funny. They're almost like a buffoonish. And so that's bad. But you can. I always try to read as a reader. I always try to move into the spaces of possible revolutionary action.
Also, if you like that sort of apprentice class, Thomas Dekker. Read plays by Thomas Dekker. He's got much more sympathy that he can maintain across an entire play.
Yeah, Shakespeare was still a working man trying to go up. Yeah.
I'm curious to go back to the sort of tension between religion and gender that you mentioned. Because I think you have a character like Joan, who is both sort of ostensibly very religious and, Catholic, but also is a witch and is kind of more masculine and a warrior. And Henry, who is very devout and is he being emasculated by his religious beliefs? Are they just a separate axis of his character? And then with the only other religiously affiliated character playing the
it doesn't speak well of people in positions of authority, period. I think it's generally, the play to me is pretty sympathetic towards Henry VI, and maybe on account of his youth, and he isn't corruptible, but he is persuadable. And so at one moment he's presented with a potential avenue for treaty by Gloucester, and then Suffolk comes with Margaret, and then the first treaty is no longer viable because he's convinced to do something different. And so that kind of weakness, I think, is not necessarily because of his religious devotion. I think in general it's his position as a child with a protectorship, and I think maybe because this is presenting a pre-Reformation religious figure, that it's okay to denigrate the bishop, Archbishop of Winchester, because this is not I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think that.
What year was this play again?
1592, roughly.
1592, okay.
But it's presenting a pre-Reformation England.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
But you're already Shakespeare in 1592, having gone through that era, and so you already have, I think, the way. That's how I read the cardinal. The fact that the cardinal was so corrupt, and and it's part of already that kind of anti-Catholic stuff.
Yeah, I mean
that was going on in England,
Spanish
especially
Armada
with
has already
Elizabeth.
been defeated by the time he writes this. So I think he could be riding a wave of.
Yeah, no, it's really he's of his time and of the ideological kind of. He's an ideological product of his time, but he's also doing, as you're saying, a pre-Reformation. So the Reformation is in the pre-Reformation kind of figure, I would say. That's how I read the cardinal, but that's just, yeah.
Shakespeare himself was a Catholic, like all the Catholics.
Yeah, some people have said that. Yeah,
So
I think.
he was keeping it hidden. These were dangerous times for Catholics, because Elizabeth was already in the throne, and Mary, who was Catholic, already killed a lot of people who were Protestants. So that's why they called her Bloody Mary, which was Elizabeth's half-sister.
Cousin, yeah.
So even though he was Catholic himself, as you said rightly, he was writing for the monarchy, and he had to please Elizabeth and the whole power structure.
Yeah, and it's in the water. It's in the water of your times.
The other thing you had mentioned, that why Shakespeare portrayed Henry VI as ineffectual. I haven't read the whole play. I must admit, I'm no Shakespeare expert. But I was looking at the history books recently as a background reading for this play, to see what was in history and how Shakespeare portrayed it. And this is a recent book published in the last 50 years. And the history book says Henry VI was an ineffectual monarch. He was not interested in statecraft. He was pious, and he was trying to, he was not interested in these things. So if Shakespeare has already, portrayed him as ineffectual, that is kind of being backed by recent history also. This is one history book. That's all.
Is that something that you found in you're doing the book on the militia? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
in terms of Henry VI and how he's seen.
My book it starts with the reign of Henry VII.
Okay.
And from Henry VII on, there's a real consolidation, a centralization of military power in the crown, whereas before the defensive organization is primarily distributed in the counties. Henry VI is a little too early for my, for my historical research.